Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As Andy mentioned, BYU is familiar territory to me, so it's a lot of fun to come back. My parents and some of my extended family are in the Provo area, so I get a twofer. I get to visit BYU and make my mom happy, which is really ultimately what's most important. That's the bottom line. So as Andy mentioned, my background is a little bit, one of the things I love about instructional design in this field is that people from so many different disciplines find this area of work and this area of study, often after studying and doing really great things in other disciplines. My personal background is in the field of architecture, and I studied architecture down at Arizona State University and practiced in the Mesa area for a little while, and then I ended up doing some graduate work in architectural history and theory. And then it was after taking those paths that I found the true department and started working in instructional technology. I studied here at BYU for a couple of years, and I had a chance to go out to Indiana University, where I know Randy from, and it's fun to see some familiar faces again. So what I would like to share with you today is Andy invited me to come and talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done. And some of the most recent research I've done would have been even more boring for this group than it would be for the group for whom it was intended. Unless you wanted to know about Louis Sullivan's ornamental designs in Chicago, which is fascinating, but maybe not for this audience. So I spoke to one of my colleagues at IU that I do a lot of collaborative with, Elizabeth Bowling, who has been the department chair, was the department chair for many years at the program out at IU, and now is working in the dean's office out at IU. And she and I have collaborated for about 10 years now on a number of different projects. And I talked to her a little bit about whether or not she would feel all right with me kind of stealing the thunder and presenting a lot of the ideas that we've actually developed together. So the first thing I want to lay out there is that I don't have complete ownership over these ideas. In fact, not very good ownership. So if there's anything that you disagree with or are troubled by, I'm going to blame it on Elizabeth. But the ideas that you like, those ones I'm sure are mine. So I shouldn't be saying this when it's being recorded. So the project that I want to talk about is this idea of design cases. And at the risk of looking like I'm groveling and recruiting, if you could please pass these around. These are cards that give a little bit more information about where this project has come in the last 4 years. It actually now is been developed into an online journal that is designed to provide opportunities for people in instructional design and other allied fields to have a place to share examples of design precedent. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is as we go along here today. Now, I always tell my students that as bored as they might feel at any time when I'm speaking, I can relate because I've had to listen to every presentation I've ever given. And it's been painful over many years, so I understand. They've also conditioned me by this point to be highly sensitive to people who look bored. So if you start to feel bored, just look bored and I'll change the topic. The last thing I wanted to mention is that startling, okay, well now we'll start talking about circus. The last thing I wanted to do is I was a little bit devastated in the last week discovering something that I should have known all along. I'm not sure why it took me so long to figure this out. I team teach a studio course right now with a colleague of mine who's a good friend. And there are probably about 25, 26 students in the class. It's a junior level class. It's a studio course where we do things like design theaters, and we're working on a big project right now. But occasionally we do have to lecture from time to time. We lecture, and this is a long class, 3 hours at a time, twice a week. So they suffer, and they let us know that they're suffering. And they all have cell phones now, right? And I knew, of course, that they were texting and doing email during class, and especially when we were lecturing. About 10 minutes into it, the attention span has decreased to the point that they need outside entertainment. And this was a little bit troubling to me, but I never took it too personally until my colleague Barb pointed out that not only were they texting, but they were texting each other about us while we were teaching. So this just raised the bar a little bit in terms of my paranoia and self-awareness as I was teaching. So if you want to know what's going on in my lecture courses, I'm sure, if you know how to follow the Twitter things, you can follow the Twitter feed, probably #boredom. It's probably the one that's up there. So anyway, with that, I want to go ahead and launch into this idea of design precedent. And there are 4 ideas that I want to share with you today. The first is, what do I mean by design precedent, and how could it possibly apply to a field like instructional design? This is for my students who would tweet to each other, what is Kennon talking about and why should I care? The second section that I want to look at a little bit is ways that we're suggesting, Elizabeth and I have been working with a number of other colleagues, how might we most productively share design precedent in instructional technology and instructional design? Third, I want to talk a little bit about some challenges that happen once we start sharing design precedent. And finally, I want to talk about some areas that we can look for inspiration beyond just those fields that we might think of as being the most closely allied or most closely related to us. Now, I took a lot of Richard Sudwick's courses, and I know he's not here, so he's not going to be able to contradict if what I'm saying is true or not, but my recollection is that in Richard Sudwick's courses, we spend a lot of time talking about definitions because words are very important, and oftentimes we're using the same words, but we mean different things. And the word precedent is one of these tricky terms because it's a word that is used very extensively in a lot of other fields, especially professional fields. So we have precedent in legal areas, we have it in the medical fields, and many other professional areas. And if we go to the Oxford English Dictionary, the definition for precedent is that which is up here, and the thing that I really want to point out is that it's a previous incident taken as an example to be guided in similar cases. And this is the part that's important, is that a lot of times in precedent when we're looking at a law profession or medical situations, the important thing is that in order for something to be a legitimate source of precedent, there needs to be a demonstrated, convincing link between the case that happened before and the situation at hand. I want to be very clear that designers do not believe in this. Designers opportunistically, unpredictably, and perhaps without permission, will go out and anything they see, anything that's happened, if they think it's relevant, it does not matter who created it, what purpose they created it for, they're going to go on and use it if they want to. So when we talk about precedent in relationship to this journal, we're not concerned about proving that there is an analogous link between what is going on before and how someone might use it in the future. Precedent is the term that we're using here because in design fields, it has been used now for many generations, and designers use this in a specialized way. Brian Lawson is one of the people who has talked most extensively about this, and if you're interested in this, he wrote an article in 2004 where he talks a lot about how designers use precedent, and he talks very extensively about how chess players, expert chess players, are able to recognize patterns in the board and how that really accelerates their ability to make good decisions in a split second in the moment. And so he talks about a designer's ability to recognize patterns, and it may be in situations that really have no relationship to an outsider between that previous instance and the one that they're talking about. So just to get that out of the way, it's a different animal than what you might be familiar with if you're really familiar with precedent as it's used in law or in other fields. This is the point where my students would say, oh my word, now she's showing us history stuff. Do you think it'll be on the exam? And usually I have to say yes so they don't fall asleep during the history part. But I just want to show a few examples of what design precedent has meant in many other design fields. This is at the core, one of the fundamental parts of many, many other design fields. And we can go back centuries to the years right after the printing press came around. These are images from a book by a designer, architect named Andrea Palladio, who was an extraordinarily famous architect in Italy in the 1500s, and his work had a massive impact on the Renaissance in Italy. But the thing that's so interesting about Palladio is he was really smart. He didn't just sit back and say, I've got a lot of great commissions now. He wrote about and published books about his work, and these books spread like wildfire throughout Europe and eventually to the United States. So 300, 400 years later, people are still building buildings that are influenced by Palladio, because they had access to these sources of precedent. They had examples of his work. And so he is considered, if you look at the history of Western architecture, probably the single most influential designer in Western architecture for many centuries, because precedent was available. Examples of his work were available widely because they were published. If we jump forward into the 1800s, these are images from a more recent edition of a book called The Grammar of Ornament that was put together by Owen Jones. Owen Jones was an English designer who was heavily involved in the 1851 Crystal Palace World's Fair. And at the World's Fair, design from all over the world came in. People had an opportunity to look at it in person. And I think we're so accustomed to seeing everything and having everything available to us through the web that we forget that there was a time that a person could live their entire life and have no clue what Greek ornament looked like, have no clue what was going on 100 miles away, let alone 2,000 or 5,000 miles away. And so these World's Fairs provided people an enormous opportunity to be exposed to design precedent, understand what was happening around the world. And Owen Jones, based on this interest, developed and put together this portfolio book that was published in the mid-1850s that has plate after plate after plate after plate that shows examples of design precedent. It had a section on Greek ornament, a section on Roman ornament, a section on medieval ornament. It goes on and on and on and on. And I'll tell you a little secret. BYU has a fantastic 1868 copy of this, and it's actually still in the stacks. So you can go look at it, you can take it home, you can Xerox it. I mean, it's just unbelievable that it's still. Now, maybe they figured out what treasure they have and they've taken it off the stacks, but you can see here in these examples, this spread is many, many examples of Greek ornament, and then a designer could look at this and either copy it or adapt it to their own use and their own needs. I also wanted to show, at the end of the book, there's a section of about 10 or a dozen plates, and if you look at these, you'll notice that they appear to be just illustrations of botanical material. And that's because these designers were interested not only in looking at the work of other physical human designers, but also looked to nature as an example of the ultimate design work. And how could that then serve as precedent in informing and inspiring the work that they were doing? So yeah, Andy.
Is this almost like he calls it a grammar, but is it actually more of a lexicon?
Well, we could really interpret it as either way. He does provide some written explanation and analysis of what he believes is going on. And so he did believe, some of these individuals did believe that there were rules to follow, much as you would have a grammar to follow in terms of doing good ornament. But again, this is an example of the opportunistic ways that even though Jones might have intended it for use in one way, designers are undisciplined in the way that they use it. And in a good way, undisciplined. So if we jump forward now into the 20th century, I want to show a couple of examples from graphic design and a couple of examples from architecture. This is an example of a series called Logo Lounge. It's been published over the last about 12 years or so. And these are compilations where designers, professional designers, can just send in the work that they're doing, and if it's selected, then it's published in this compilation. And a few of the logos that are in this have some description about the process, but for the most part, it's just page after page after page of images without any explanation. The only information that's provided is the name of the designer and the client for whom it was done. You might say, well, what use is that? Well, the designers will look at this and draw inspiration and understand the process that went behind the creation of those. So let's say these spreads are from examples of the great cats. So these are all logos that are based on lions and tigers, okay? And if you look down here, here are 3 examples that I've blown up to show them in more detail. And as you look at these, you can see that some of them are extraordinarily abstracted, like the one over on the far right-hand side. Others are far more realistic, and then some are stylized. So the designer can look at this and understand how their contemporaries, their peers, are approaching this issue or this problem of creating a logo for a client who has some sort of logotype or some sort of mascot, and read into all of those different examples ways of approaching their own problem. This is a different approach. This is a book written by Nigel Holmes, who became extremely influential in the world of graphic design because he worked for a long time for Time magazine. So many of the icons and graphics that appeared in Time magazine were Nigel Holmes' work. The thing that's different about this collection is that Nigel Holmes provides like these tiny case studies for every single one of them. So instead of just showing the final product, he provides some text that describes maybe who the client was, what the situation was, what was going on at the time, his own process, and then he shows images that trace his process. The thing that's very interesting about an example like this is, if we look back at the Logo Lounge example, the danger in some of these is that a novice designer who is just looking at this and looks at page after page after page of final logos may come away with the misconception that designers just sit down and think up something in their mind and then go to the computer and create it, because there's no trace of the process that went into it. And that's one of the real struggles that we actually face in design education, is helping people understand the iterative process. And that you will develop many, many ideas, and usually the purpose in developing an idea and working with it is not to submit that as the final product, but as a part of a process that gets them to something. And so this example of design precedent is more useful for students in a teaching situation, because I'm able to point to something like this and say, look, don't stress out so much about the very first thing you put on the paper. You're going to throw it away anyway. Look, Nigel Holmes, one of the most famous graphic designers in the United States from the 20th century, he went through a dozen before he got to the one that he wanted. Why in the world do you think you're going to get it on the first try? I want to see 50, that kind of thing. So one of the other things I want to point out by showing and contrasting these two examples, they're both examples of design precedent, and both of them are useful. So the actual way that design precedent is communicated is not what determines its usefulness. It's the audience that determines its usefulness. So for a student audience, this might be more useful. For a professional who just wants many, many ideas and doesn't want to have to slog through the process where it already understands process, the logo lounge might be more useful. Does that make sense? So utility isn't embedded in the case. It comes about in an interaction between the designer and the precedent material that they expose themselves to. A couple of examples from architecture. This is the Art Institute in Chicago, an extremely famous institution, and a number of years ago they expanded and built this huge additional wing to house their architecture and their design collections. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most phenomenal collections in the United States, both in terms of the fine arts and also in terms of design and architecture. When they wanted to work on this, they commissioned an extraordinarily famous architect, Renzo Piano, to do the work in his firm, and then when it was completed, they published this book that showed and traced much of his process work. Now, for the museum, this was promotional. For the architect, this was self-promotional and marketing. But for the designer, this is useful precedent. Final example that I want to show is this compilation that is an entire volume that is devoted to just one building, an extremely famous skyscraper building by Frank Lloyd Wright, the Price Tower. And this was edited, a compilation put together by one of the most preeminent Wright scholars in the United States. And if you look at the table of contents, you can see it has a number of different people who are submitting different essays that provide scholarly critique and historical analysis of this building. And then there's also graphical analysis that shows you kind of a graphical breakdown of the geometry of the building, and then also some of the process work that Wright put into it. The reason that I find this to be an interesting example, just like the one that we looked at before, is the purpose of this, ostensibly, was scholarly research. Allison already has tenure, so he's not getting it for tenure, but maybe some of those people that contributed to it, they have their own motivation for creating this and disseminating this. It does not matter what the purpose was of creating it to the designer who uses it. So design cases, oftentimes their utility or their use is not even connected to the purpose for which it was initially created. So often, and the reason I'm harping on this is because so often when we do research work, we're very concerned about understanding the audience and checking off all those boxes to make sure that it's valid and reliable and that it meets all of these standards so that we can kind of predetermine or have a guess ahead of time who it's going to be useful for or how it might be used. Design precedent, people using it do not care. That is not what's important to them. So how do we share design precedent in ID? Well, there are a few ways that we have traditionally disseminated work that we've done. And, I could run down to any school and grab a textbook off the shelf, right? So what in the world is Kennon so hyped about? We've got design precedent all around ourselves. We can look at it anywhere we want. The difference between just running down to a school and grabbing a textbook off a shelf is, while that's a great example of precedent in the final product, there really is no process that allows for an exploration of what went into the creation of that product. There is no critique of that product that is alongside with it. And so while that might be some useful precedent, there is a different approach that we see happening in many other traditional design fields where they invest a tremendous amount of energy and effort into providing this precedent material and critiquing it along the way. And they also develop these cultures of how to use design precedent. So in our own field, we do have some examples of design cases, but these are often simplified so that they're understandable for the novice. And so they may not present a really authentic picture of the complexity that went into the creation of the final product. And so they can actually lead sometimes to misconceptions for novice designers about design process. We see design precedent as a little bit different than design-based research. So often in design-based research, the product or the artifact that's created is a treatment in the experiment or in the study. And so it might be described as part of the larger context provided, but the end goal of design-based research is not necessarily a deeper understanding of that product so much as the creation of generalizable findings that can help lead to better understandings of theory. Product and program evaluations, these also sometimes contain some description of the product, but oftentimes not to the same depth. There are limits on the number of pages that you can have, the number of images, and so we really struggle with flooding novice designers with examples of design precedent. So design cases, I'm not suggesting that they replace any of these other very useful tools for sharing and disseminating knowledge, but that they can exist alongside as an additional way of looking at and helping people investigate and dig into what's happening in our field. Yeah, Andy?
Now, the emphasis in a design case, is it on the process by which the design was created, or the content of the design itself?
Both.
Yes.
Both. So it's a narrative and a descriptive case.
Good.
Is what I'm going to recommend here today. Yeah.
I'm just curious, like in architecture, do you have anything comparable to like the teaching cases, like they're kind of design case, but not
We
necessarily?
do, but there's much less emphasis because traditionally what will happen is the architect instructor will go straight to this other precedent material. And so the teacher or the professor acts as a mediator to help the novice deal with the complexity that's in the real case instead of stripping the case away, stripping some of the complexity away. Yeah. And I'll actually show some examples of how they explicitly teach people to use design precedent here. So I'm going to show a slide, design precedent and ID, rigorous design cases. I'm going to say something that sounds totally contradictory to what I said earlier, and that is the idea that utility resides in the situation where the designer is interacting with the case instead of being a character or a component of the case itself. And this is the contradiction. Okay, so as we're thinking about providing a venue for people to share design cases, and this is not a tradition that is really heavily developed in instructional design, at least, bless you, at least in the way that we were envisioning it might be. How could we bridge the gap? What language could we use to talk to a community of scholars and designers who do not necessarily have this tradition of sharing design precedent? What language are they already familiar with that might help them ease into this idea of design cases? And there are some approaches in the areas of qualitative research that share some of the really important goals that we see as also being goals in design cases. So design cases are not necessarily issues where we're concerned about reliability and validity, but utility of design case may be enhanced if a person trusts that the story is true, or trusts that it is an authentic description of the process and not a glorified, prettied up account of how everything went right all the time. We know that's not true. It doesn't go right all the time. And so there are a couple of places in qualitative research that might provide us some tools to guide the creation of these descriptive narrative accounts of design cases, instructional design. And one area that we're recommending is actually turning to the tradition of naturalistic inquiry, the work being done by people like, that's been done by people like Lincoln and Guba. And instead of asking are design cases reliable and valid, asking instead, are they created in a way that's trustworthy? And so some of the methods from naturalistic inquiry that enhance the trustworthiness of a case are listed here: prolonged engagement, persistent observation, and we come down this list. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. In the very first issue of Design or IJDL, there is an article that goes through and walks through everything that's here and kind of presents an argument for why this might be a useful tradition to draw on or be inspired by as we're developing design cases. But again, the things that I want to point out here is just as utility is not predetermined in the case, we also recognize that designers will use these cases opportunistically and unpredictably, and that trustworthiness is not the same as length, and trustworthiness is not the same as utility. We see trustworthiness as a potential tool in enhancing the likelihood of utility, but not as a guarantee of utility. And the one other area that may provide some useful insights is that of action research. These design cases, as they are often presented in many other design fields, the people who were involved in the creation of the design are oftentimes the primary informants, and sometimes the actual authors of the pieces. Now that creates a real conflict of interest in some research traditions. Can participants also be reliable informants and researchers? And one area that does provide some tools for getting around this issue is that of action research, where typically the participants are empowered as the researchers. The participants are the ones developing knowledge. The participants are the ones also understanding how to apply that knowledge later on. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. This is also in that same article in the first issue of the journal. So some considerations in developing this. We are suggesting that by applying some of these tools from other qualitative research traditions, we might be able to shape or start talking about what a rigorous design case looks like or could look like in instructional design. But we recognize that an instructional design case is not the same as a rigorous design process. The rigorous design process, if we expect someone to follow analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation, and have all those pieces together, that might be called or considered a rigorous design process. You could do a really rigorous design case about a situation that was an absolute disaster in process, right? In fact, it might be really helpful if we had some rigorous design cases about disasters or failures in instructional design. Wouldn't that be interesting for students to see what can go wrong? And there are people that create these design cases in other fields. You can go and look at entire books on engineering disasters.
Challenger.
Exactly. Challenger is one of the main ones, and there's been a tremendous amount of literature that's come out on that. There's been a tremendous amount of literature that's come out from the Twin Towers, and architectural codes have changed because of those. Tremendous amount has been learned because of those failures, but it's only because people investigate those failures and are willing to talk about them. Yes?
All those examples you did at the beginning,
Yeah.
like, almost all of them came from practitioners, like they were very heavily in that. Like,
Yes.
and if you look at academic journals and instructional design, pretty much it's all academics.
Yes.
So would this approach require like changing of that, like maybe either increased participation or like, I don't know.
That's an excellent question, and I'll try to answer it in a couple of ways. One is that was the motivation for the development of this journal, is that many of the journals that are out there today have different standards for rigor and different interests. And it's not that those interests are wrong, we just didn't see any really good venue for sharing this kind of information. And one of the challenges that we face in trying to shepherd and help people work through these design cases is many of them are practitioners who aren't accustomed to writing. And so this is often a very laborious process. On the other hand, when academics write these cases, we have the exact opposite problems. They're trying to prove what theory they used from step one, and we're like, oh, give me a break. You did not know that up front. I know you didn't know that up front. And I know you messed up along the way. Tell me the truth. So this is kind of this sticky wicket that's somewhere in between the two, and we're facing problems and difficulties in helping people who aren't accustomed to writing to describe and honestly lay out their entire process. And on the other hand, people who are very accustomed to writing to think about, I really don't care if you think you were doing one thing. I want to know the truth, not don't write the way you need to write for a journal where you can only sound like you're doing it right all the time. Yes?
Is the role of academics in architecture like pretty similar to the role of academics? Like, how can you compare them? Like, in what way are they different?
The tradition of architecture is one that has a very heavy component in apprenticeship, and almost all of the faculty are practitioners. And there's a tremendous argument going on right now in the field of architecture as to whether or not that's sufficient. And they're just beginning to develop some PhD programs in architecture. And this is creating a huge cultural clash between those who are very concerned about preserving the ability to practice rigorously and those who are concerned about what research should look like. And it especially becomes an issue for tenure and promotion because the practitioners want to keep building great buildings. They don't want to spend their time writing journal articles, and academics want to see journal articles. So I'm getting a little bit off case right now, but architecture is running into its own problems but they're coming at this from a different angle, and that's one of the things that I find so interesting about kind of blending these perspectives instructional design has some tremendously valuable insights about how to do research, how to disseminate knowledge, how to make a transfer from what's going on the ground to what might be a generalizable principle that would be useful to someone else. Architects are approaching it a completely different thing. In fact, they don't want to be generalizable. Generalizable is a dirty word because you want to be creative. You want to do something no one's ever done before. If you can boil it down to a few rules, then why shouldn't I just sit down and let my CAD computer spit out a plan? No, I want to do something completely new and different. And so these intersections between these two very different traditions about approaching knowledge and work have been really, really interesting. And I think we still have a lot to explore in these intersections. Does that answer your question, Mark? Okay. So if you want to read some more about these potential obstacles we've run into, Craig Howard just recently published an article also in JEDL, I believe in the 2012 group of articles, and you can look at his discussion. Now I know we're getting close, we've got only about 10 minutes left, and I want to leave a couple minutes open at the end for some discussion, but I want to point out just a couple of things very quickly. I mentioned that there's this real tradition of using design precedent in architecture and many other fields, and I'm really drawing on architectural law because that's what I'm most familiar with. But we see the same things happening in graphic design, in interior design, in typography, and many of these other specialized fields. In architecture, we face some real problems with precedent and with disseminating this stuff so much. One of these problems is that instead of abstracting and drawing lessons from precedent, we sometimes run into problems with students copying, imitating what's come before. And so that can become a real barrier in exploring their own expertise and developing their own voice. One of the other issues is that sometimes when they adopt a solution or adapt it, they may pull something from a completely different setting and plug it into a situation where it has no business being. So for example, they might sit down and look at the latest issue of Progressive Architecture, or they're out of business now, it's Architecture Magazine, and they might see a beautiful building done for the Pacific Northwest up in Washington State. All wood, all glass, set in a forest, and they fall in love with it. They think it's beautiful, and it is. It is absolutely gorgeous. And so in their studio project, they've been assigned a lot in Phoenix, Arizona, and they start slapping big timbers and glass, and first of all, the timber's gonna rot and dry up, and it's gonna be a solar oven in that building, you know, so sometimes when students are exposed to a tremendous amount of precedent, in the beginning they will make these inappropriate adaptations from what they've seen to their own situation. And the last is what I call the hero worship system. We might not know the names of the very best instructional designers in the world, and maybe that's a problem or maybe that's good. But we know who the very best, or who literature thinks are the very best architects. And if I have to see another Zaha Hadid inspired building from a student, I just think I'm going to throw up. You know, I am so tired of seeing some of these same things show up over and over again, where even though they are being very careful about the way they adapt it, you know, just because that's the person that's getting the most press, that doesn't mean that's the only voice that you should be listening to or looking at. So sometimes they get these blinders on. So how do we try to combat that? I want to show you just a couple of examples. People are very intentional about how they teach students to use precedent, and usually the students are completely confused for about the first 4 years, and then it usually clicks right about the time they graduate. But one of these is a book by Simon Unwin, who has released really a very interesting series of books about analyzing architecture. And this explicitly breaks down buildings for students and teaches them how to abstract from buildings principles and ideas that might be useful in their own context. And the thread that's here is a Palladio building, Villa Rotunda, one of the most famous buildings in Western architecture. And they do show drawings of the actual building, but then he starts to break it down and analyze the underlying geometry until we have something that's completely an abstraction of that geometry that might be applicable to the organization of space in another project. And there's a lot of text, a lot of instruction, direct instruction going along with this. Another series that has been very successful and has been around now for, well, 1985, so it'll be going on 25 years now. This series called Precedents in Architecture. And what's very interesting about this is these authors identify 12 major concerns or issues that architects have to grapple with in any situation. So issues like structure, how are we going to hold the thing up, natural light, how are we going to make sure that people can see inside, massing, plan to section, unit to hold, blah, blah, blah. So they've identified these 12, and then what they do is they systematically go through and identify for about 100 different buildings how you might graphically analyze every single one of those buildings according to these 12 different criteria. Okay? So this is Frank Boyd's Falling Water, and they go through and diagrammatically show how do we look at just the structure, how do we look just at the solution for natural light. And so this could be precedent that a student could use to look to, but it's also a very valuable tool to understand how to apply or how to learn from precedent. And then what he does, these two authors do, is after they've gone through about 100 different case studies, in the back they have a section that is just by theme. So you've looked at 100 buildings now, okay? Here are 12 examples where they used this organizing strategy of concentric space. But look how differently they did it. So if you want to understand how architects deal with concentric space, don't just look at the one. Understand how differently that's been done with different geometries for different clients, for different types of buildings over centuries. Okay? And so they do that with concentric space, overlapping units, and so they go through many of these different themes or plan to section and give many examples that look on the surface very different, but the underlying strategy is very similar. Okay, the very last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about breaking the disciplinary boundaries to find design precedent. So if we are going to, if you're into this idea, I don't know if this has been convincing at all, I really hope that we will continue to look at ways to disseminate design precedent in instructional design. I think it's going to be a huge boon for novices, people who are learning, people who are outside our field, and also for professionals. So where should we look? Well, obviously, we as instructional designers might be able to create and disseminate a lot of design precedent in places like IJDL, but where else could we look? And I want to, anyone in here from biological sciences are already familiar with biomimicry? Okay, let's see, you're nodding your head yes? You familiar with biomimicry?
Just read a little bit
Okay,
about
we all need to know about biomimicry, right? Thank you for agreeing with me. So, biomimicry is this very interesting collaboration between biologists and designers. And the idea is that in contemporary society, we have to deal with a lot of changing conditions, extraordinarily complex problems. And we can look for inspiration to many different areas to figure out how to do that. We can look to what other designers are doing, we can look to history. But this group of individuals are very interested in looking at how these solutions have been solved in biological systems and biological entities. So it's a science that studies nature's models and then emulates forms, processes, systems, strategies to solve human problems. Sounds kind of like using precedent, right? Looking for solutions, strategies. And if you haven't already seen it, I hugely recommend that you look. There's a TED Talk by the individual who has really been pivotal in developing this idea. But let me just show you a few examples. And then I'm going to ask, if biology is a really great place for product designers to look, what other disciplines could we as instructional designers look to for inspiration and precedent? Okay, the bullet train that they developed over in Asia went so fast that when it was coming out of the tunnels, it was creating a sonic boom that was heard a quarter mile away, and people were really unhappy with that, okay? One of the people who was involved with this was also an avid birder, and he noticed that the kingfisher bird, when it would go from air into water to catch fish, there was no disturbance of the new medium, no disturbance of the water, perfectly flat, going from air to water, changing medium. And examined the architecture design of the front of the bird, adapted the train to mimic that. And then when they are going from one medium or one density of air into another, they drastically reduce the disturbance. The trains go faster, they make less noise, and they use less electricity. So again, looking to nature for a solution. Here's another one I really like. One of the major problems that we face is trying to figure out how to keep our surfaces clean, especially in medical facilities, right? And one of the traditional ways that we've kept surfaces clean and from getting dirty is by applying sometimes harsh chemicals that can then create chemical sensitivities for people and are also expensive. what could we learn from nature? The lotus plant appears very smooth, and you can see over on the far right slide, it looks like a smooth surface. And these slides, I need to say right now, are all completely ripped off the biomimicry site, okay? Not my images. Complete plagiarism here. But if you look at the lotus plant very close up, you'll notice that there are these tiny, tiny rough surfaces. And there's so much rough surface that dirt and water cannot embed into the plant, but instead beat up and roll off of it. So they're looking at ways to develop textiles that have actually on a microscopic level these similar surfaces so that dirt and pollutants can no longer adhere to the surface and can just be wiped clean. This is one of my favorite examples, medicines. So many of our medicines are actually based on plant materials, but there are hundreds of thousands, millions of different plant materials out there. How do we even know what to look for? What might possibly be useful to us as human beings in solving medical problems? And if we just start testing everything one by one, we're never going to get through it. What scientists started to recognize is that there are populations of chimpanzees that have already discovered how to treat their own illnesses through the use of different medicinal plants. And our DNA is similar enough that by looking at what products these animals are using, it helps scientists narrow down and focus first on those that might be most useful in the development of human medicines, might have beneficial medicinal effects. Very last one. There's a tremendous interest in how to create cars and other structures that are as safe as possible, but also as light as possible. So, you know, I drove my 1993 Buick LeSabre until it absolutely literally rusted out on the bottom, and my mechanic told me I wasn't even allowed to drive it away because it no longer had any brake fluid in it. But I was always comfortable in my Buick LeSabre because that thing was a tank, right? I mean, it was so heavy that you don't even have to put your foot on the gas if you're on an incline, because you're just going to be cruising for a long time. Now, different story going uphill. But as we look at trying to make cars lighter and lighter, one of the concerns is how do we also make sure that they're still structurally safe? And engineers have looked at the structure of trees and also the structure of the human skeleton to understand how these dynamic systems either provide more or less material in different areas to only provide material where it's really most needed. So I show these examples to say, you know, biology and design, the biologists that came up with much of this information, they were not thinking, oh, I'm going to study the human skeleton so that someday a designer knows how to design a car. No. But by the integration of these different bodies of knowledge, there is an effect that is much greater than either of them is in isolation. And so one of my questions is, where else could we look for inspiration about how to solve the problems we face in instructional design? And I don't know for sure, but one of the areas I think might be interesting is storytelling. Storytelling is all about the dissemination of knowledge and ideas in a way that is intrinsically motivating to people. Wouldn't it be interesting to have some design cases with people who are writers and understand their process for creating really rich environments and motivational situations? Game design. We oftentimes use game design in trying to figure out, well, how can I turn this spelling unit into a game so that the student will engage with it? But beyond that, what else could we learn about motivation by looking at game design situations and what works or what's failed? Not just from the academic standpoint, but from the standpoint of the people who are inside creating these things. The last one, playground design, is a site for rich interaction in play, social interaction. What do playground designers need to know and think about to create really rich environments? So, again, we represent many, many different disciplines. We can really leverage that. I know about architectural precedent because that's where I came from, but where did you come from? What expertise do you have? And how might that provide an insight into design precedent and design cases for us? So that's my concluding question. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Kennon.
I know time is short. If there is time for questions, I'd be happy.
There's time for questions, yes there is. Another potential source
Yes.
would be observing conversations and,
Yes.
and how people converse.
Yes, I think so. I think it would be very interesting to talk to professional negotiators and how they deal with negotiation settings to understand maybe what communication could look like also in a learning setting.
So when you're writing a study of a design, you identified several different patterns. You can You can look at the terminology of a practice
Yes.
and create either grammar, a lexicon, or whatever, a swatch book. You can take one design and get multiple views of it, like the skyscraper.
Yes.
So what you've done is you've shown us several different kinds of study that can be done analyzing designs, both looking at the process of the design and the content of the design. Wow.
Yeah, and just one point, Charles, one of the advantages that these fields have is that there's a tremendous amount of pre-existing investment in it. So to create these studies that look across many, many different things, they have at their disposal the work of generations of other historians and critics. I think we face a little bit more difficult challenge because we are building up a base on which to have these discussions. And so I would hope that eventually we will be able to look across many different examples, but we have to have access to those examples and rich descriptive accounts of them and understandings before we can maybe do those cross example studies. Charles?
Well, one of the things that I'm wondering about is how do we get designers to look beyond the surface layers of a design? So, look, I've been looking a lot in my domain, which is online and blended learning, and it seems like a lot of the designs that happen in that realm, or when people talk about the designs, they are really focusing on the surface layers. And I'm not sure what the best way is to help people think about different
Ways of talking about
different ways of talking about the design, or different ways of talking about how to go about it, as opposed to kind of the focus on those.
I have two responses. The first is that I think actually it would be helpful if we had more discussions about surface features. We talk about them, but not in a very rigorous or focused way. So, for example, some of those precedent examples from architecture are in some ways surface features, but they're looked at in a critical way and in a way that people become disciplined to draw from an inspiration without imitation. But that takes a lot of sophistication and understanding of how to use precedent. And so I don't think that we will make much progress by saying we can't talk about surface features, but maybe changing the conversation about where we go next after we've talked about surface features.
Or maybe even how those surface features interact with other features or other layers.
Exactly. And then the next component also that's often missing is a question about how a person came to those surface features. And if it's just because they thought it looked cool, well then we need to be honest about that. And so I see it not as a potential stumbling block, but maybe if we start thinking about what we're doing with those conversations, maybe as a really rich source of inspiration.
Like, structurally speaking, what has changed, do you think, for kind of more of this approach to gain adoption in construction design?
I think that the students who are in the programs now and are going to be the practitioners and teachers in the coming generations need to start doing it. I think it's a process that's going to take time if it's something that we want to do.
Well, I mean, but how are they going to influence, like, these educating bodies? I mean, the educating bodies like this program, like, they've kind of got their system, and I mean, it's not like this some practitioners can come back and say, I got this great idea, like, we should teach it this way. I just don't see that happening very easily.
Well, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I do see this. I don't think that we need to become architecture in terms of the way we use precedent. And architecture could learn a lot from us in instructional design about the rigorous sharing of knowledge and case study. And we've actually presented this to architects, and they're like, oh my word, yeah, naturalistic inquiry, what's that? Oh, that's a great idea. So I think there's a happy medium somewhere in the middle, and I don't know what the answer to that. I guess, bottom line, I don't know what the answer is. but I'm very interested in watching the process. I think there's a lot of potential. I think this is a first step, and if you haven't checked out some of the cases that are already published here, I'd really encourage you to look at them, and it's going to be interesting to see where it goes from here.
Let's take this discussion down
Okay,
to the soup
absolutely.
kitchen and do ourselves. Thank you again, Kennon.
Thank you.